Okay, we need a good deal in the right time. And what we don't need is chasing a deal or chasing a small deal that disadvantages us for the bigger deal. We're ready to sit down. We could sit down this afternoon and hammer the whole thing out over the course of the next 10 days.
Mark Carney didn't just reject a small deal with Donald Trump. He shut down the entire strategy behind it. Because once Canada refused to play by Washington's rules, the negotiation stopped being about pressure and started becoming a standoff Trump can no longer control. As of April 2026, trade tensions between Canada and the United States are escalating ahead of the scheduled CUSMA review, the agreement that governs more than $1 trillion in annual trade across North America. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, is pushing for a fast-moving renegotiation built around tariffs, sectoral leverage, and early concessions. The U.S. position has become increasingly clear. Canada is expected to make concessions up front in key areas, such as industrial policy, digital taxation, and strategic sectors, before meaningful negotiations even begin. This approach is widely described as pay-to-play, where access to talks is conditional on giving ground first. Canada has already tested that approach. Early in Carney's tenure, Ottawa removed its planned digital services tax targeting major U.S. tech firms, a move framed as goodwill. Instead of stabilizing relations, it triggered further demands from Washington. This time, the response is different. Carney has publicly refused to chase any partial or rushed deal. His position is direct. Canada will negotiate, but only on terms that protect long-term national interests, not short-term political timelines. That decision has shifted the entire trajectory of the negotiation. The core of Trump's strategy is not tariffs alone. It is sequencing. Apply pressure, extract concessions, then formalize a deal that locks those gains in place. This model works when the other side believes delay is more costly than compromise. Canada no longer accepts that premise. Carney's refusal to engage in a pay-to-play structure is not simply a negotiating tactic, but a rejection of the entire framework. Conceding early, especially in sectors tied to long-term economic capacity, would weaken Canada's position across every subsequent phase of negotiation. In industries like autos, steel, and energy, where cross-border integration is complex and capital-intensive, early concessions can translate into long-term structural disadvantages worth tens of billions of dollars over time. By stepping away from that model, Canada is not slowing negotiations, it is resetting them.
The decision to remove the digital services tax provides a clear case study. That policy was designed to capture revenue from large multinational tech firms operating in Canada, with potential annual value in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Its removal was framed as a signal of cooperation. The response from Washington was not stabilization, it was escalation. Additional tariff threats followed, along with broader demands across other sectors. The lesson is straightforward. In a pressure-driven framework, concessions are not endpoints. They are starting points for further demands. Carney's current stance reflects that lesson. There is no longer an expectation that goodwill will produce reciprocity. Instead, there is an assumption that unilateral concessions increase exposure without reducing pressure.
The United States continues to operate from the position that Canada depends on access to the U.S. market. That remains partially true, with a majority of Canadian exports still flowing south. But dependency in this relationship runs both ways, and in some sectors, it runs deeper on the U.S. side. Canada supplies a significant share of U.S. crude oil imports, with American refineries built specifically to process that grade. Substituting those inputs would require costly adjustments or reliance on less stable global suppliers. In manufacturing, particularly autos and aerospace, components move across the border multiple times during production. Disrupting that system increases costs, reduces efficiency, and weakens competitiveness. The scale of integration means that aggressive decoupling is not a clean policy shift, it is an economic shock. Even U.S. lawmakers have begun pushing back on tariff policies, with rare bipartisan votes signaling concern that these measures are harming American industries tied to Canada. This creates a ceiling on how much pressure Washington can apply before the costs begin to feed back into its own economy. Trump's strategy depends on controlling the pace of negotiation. Quick deals produce clear political wins, reinforce messaging, and demonstrate authority. That control disappears when the other side refuses to move on that timeline. Carney's approach introduces a different variable: time as leverage. Canada is not waiting passively. It is actively building alternatives, expanding trade relationships beyond North America, and investing in domestic capacity across energy, infrastructure, and critical minerals. This creates strategic flexibility. The longer negotiations stretch, the more pressure shifts toward the U.S. side, where exporters face uncertainty, supply chains remain unstable, and political pressure begins to build internally. And that pressure is already visible in hard data. Canadian visits to the United States have fallen for more than a year straight, with some months showing declines of over 20%, and in certain categories like road travel, drops have reached as high as 30–35% compared to pre-tension levels. Given that Canadian tourists spent roughly $20.5 billion annually in the U.S. before the downturn, even a 20% decline translates into an economic hit of around $4 to $5 billion, directly impacting local businesses, retail, and service jobs. More importantly, this decline is not being offset by other international visitors, meaning the loss is structural rather than temporary. A strategy built on speed loses effectiveness when speed is no longer required. That is the point at which an endgame stops being achievable. What is emerging is not simply a delayed agreement, but a redefined relationship. Canada is no longer negotiating from a position of urgency. It is negotiating from a position of choice. By refusing to engage in a system that rewards early concessions, Canada has forced the United States into a more complex environment, where outcomes depend not just on pressure, but on alignment. And alignment is harder to impose than concessions. This is where the balance shifts. Because once a negotiation becomes a standoff, the side that can absorb time, diversify risk, and maintain internal stability holds the advantage. Recent investment data reinforces this resilience, with foreign direct investment into Canada reaching nearly $97 billion in 2025, one of the strongest inflows in decades despite ongoing trade tensions. At this stage, that side is Canada. This is not a moment defined by a single policy decision or a single speech. It is defined by a shift in strategy. Canada did not escalate. It did not match pressure with pressure. Instead, it stepped outside the structure that made that pressure effective. By refusing to chase a deal, rejecting pay-to-play terms, and preparing for a longer horizon, Canada has removed the core conditions that Trump's strategy depends on. The result is not a breakdown in negotiation, but a transformation of it. And that raises a critical question going forward. If the United States cannot dictate the pace, cannot secure early concessions, and cannot force alignment through pressure, what exactly remains of the strategy it is trying to execute?
With the international system under increasing pressure, we want to work together and with our partners to uphold and defend peace, security and prosperity. Today we can announce that we've agreed to deepen our relationship across several areas.
Canada and Australia have just delivered one of the most consequential diplomatic breakthroughs of 2026. The two countries signed a sweeping upgrade in their partnership, covering critical minerals, clean energy, defense modernization, and AI governance, a package so deep it now anchors a new Pacific strategy built outside Washington's control. And in the middle of Trump's escalating tariff campaign, this alliance gives Canada something priceless: leverage.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's visit to Canberra was not symbolic. It produced a structural shift in how Canada positions itself in the Indo-Pacific. Standing with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Carney confirmed that Australia will join Canada's G7-aligned Critical Minerals Production Alliance, that the two countries will synchronize their strategic stockpiles, and that both governments are locking in a clean energy partnership and a defense agenda stretching from the Arctic to the Pacific. This wasn't just diplomatic language. Australia committed $1.2 billion, roughly $850 million, to build its strategic minerals reserve, targeting high-risk materials such as antimony, gallium, and rare earths. During the same trip, major Australian investors, including IFM, signaled up to $10 billion in future investments into Canadian mining, energy, and AI infrastructure. For Canada, facing unpredictable U.S. tariffs, that infusion of capital changes the equation. Meanwhile, Canada is fast-tracking its own domestic projects. Ottawa has already moved to accelerate $6.4 billion, roughly $4.6 billion, worth of new critical mineral developments, from nickel and graphite to copper and lithium. And the government's approval of a U.S. $60 billion merger between Anglo-American and Teck Resources, creating one of the world's largest copper producers, is expected to bring 4,000 new jobs and more than $4.5 billion in industry spending over the next several years. This is the real context behind the Canberra announcement. Canada is not only diversifying away from Washington, it's becoming a heavyweight in the resources that power the global economy.
Carney and Albanese both spoke of a world where middle powers must take control of their own futures, when the U.S. swings from cooperation to coercion, and when China dominates key supply chains. Countries like Canada and Australia no longer have the luxury of depending on great power consistency. The two leaders are building an architecture that protects them regardless of who occupies the White House. And this is not a small alignment. Together, Canada and Australia control over 1/3 of the world's lithium and uranium supply, along with enormous reserves of nickel, cobalt, and rare earths, the backbone of everything from electric vehicle batteries to advanced defense systems. In a world of geopolitical pressure, whoever controls the upstream inputs controls the negotiations. Canada is now pairing its natural advantages with a partner that shares the same incentives. Critical minerals are where the alliance becomes undeniably strategic. Trump's approach to Canada has been simple: weaponize tariffs on metals, EV components, and industrial goods to force production into the U.S. But this calculus falls apart when Canada locks arms with a country that is also a top global producer. Australia's US $850 million strategic reserve program strengthens stability in prices and supply, reducing exposure to market manipulation. Meanwhile, the anticipated US $10 billion investment flow into Canada will supercharge mines, refineries, and clean tech manufacturers, allowing Canada to grow without relying on US capital or approval. By joining forces, the two countries effectively create a dual engine for clean tech supply chains, one that Washington cannot easily pressure. If even a fraction of this mineral output is routed into Indo-Pacific markets, Canada gains bargaining power in ways no tariff can suppress. The clean energy dimension adds another layer. Canada's grid is already 85% emissions-free, powered by hydro, nuclear, and renewables. Australia is scaling hydrogen and solar production at industrial levels. Their new partnership links two of the world's most ambitious clean energy producers at the exact moment the United States is retreating. Trump's administration has slowed offshore wind, tightened approvals for new transmission, and rolled back clean tech incentives. While the U.S. second-guesses the energy transition, Canada and Australia are building a platform that markets can trust, and capital follows trust. If Canadian clean energy developers capture even 5–10% of Australia's outbound green investment appetite, that represents billions in long-term capital formation, more than enough to cushion the economic shock of Trump's tariffs. This is not simply environmental policy, it is an economic security strategy. The defense partnership may be the most politically symbolic. Canada's Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar project, the largest defense export in Australia's history, is a signal that Canada is no longer waiting for American procurement cycles or congressional gridlock to modernize its security. By integrating Australia into its defense architecture, Ottawa is building redundancy. If the U.S. shifts priorities, delays NORAD modernization, or pressures Canada on defense spending, all scenarios seen before, Canada will still have a robust network of suppliers and collaborators. This strengthens sovereignty, it reduces vulnerability, and in an era where Washington uses economic pressure as a negotiating tactic, strategic independence becomes a form of insurance. Canada and Australia aligning their AI safety institutes also matters more than it seems. AI governance is quickly becoming the foundation for trade rules, public procurement, and national security planning. Countries that set early standards will influence billions of dollars in global investment. The US is pushing deregulation. Canada and Australia are pushing safe integration and public sector control. If Ottawa and Canberra succeed in shaping the standards for G7 markets, American companies may soon need to comply with Canadian-Australian norms, not the other way around. For Canada, this is soft power with hard value. The Canada-Australia partnership is not a diplomatic footnote. It is a shift in the global balance of economic and strategic power. With over US $15 billion in new mineral and investment commitments, a $6.4 billion domestic mining expansion, and thousands of jobs created across Canada's industrial heartlands, this alliance transforms Canada from tariff target to geopolitical architect. And it arrives exactly when Trudeau's successor, Mark Carney, needs it most. Trump is raising tariffs, supply chains are tightening. The 2026 USMCA review is approaching, but Canada now has partners with both economic weight and political alignment, partners who are not interested in coercive trade or zero-sum deals. So the question now is clear. As Canada strengthens its alliances across the Indo-Pacific, will Trump recalibrate, or will he double down and push Canada further into the arms of new partners? Canada no longer plays defense. It is building something, and the world is starting to notice.